Well, see, I got moved back to Emporia. I came back in a covered wagon. Mm-hmm. My dad had two horses and then a spare team, and they took turns pulling the covered wagon, and they made the trip all the way from Colby to Emporia. And when they came into the yard in Emporia, my granddad saw these old emaciated horses, and he ran out with a big, beautiful piece of alfalfa hay and offered it to them. They didn't know what it was. They wouldn't eat it. Fortunately, if they'd eaten it, they'd been sick. So these horses were raised on tumbleweeds. That's all they knew for food in western Kansas. So
that was Russian thistle.
Yeah, Russian thistle things that they were having to do out there. And it was an amazing period there, because I didn't know anything about what the trip west because I was just a little too young. But that summer, they'd moved in the winter, and that summer my grandmother died, and I can remember her funeral in 1913, the latter part of 1913. I can still remember her funeral because I rode, the undertaker had a special wagon for the family, and I rode on my dad's lap in the front seat next to the driver. And that's the first thing I can remember that I can remember happening, was going to that funeral in the latter part of 1913. I was a little over 2 years old.
So you just went to a regular school
I started grade school when I was 5 years old, and they had an 18-year-old teacher that just got out of high school, and she wasn't able to. It was the clouds for World War I were starting, and the neighborhood was half Scotch-Irish and half German, and they had a few Welsh there. Well, the Welsh are famous for being promoters, and they promoted fights between the German kids and the Scotch-Irish kids, and I was getting beat up so bad every day that Mother decided that I'd better be homeschooled, so they took me out of school when I was 5 years old, and I didn't go back to school until I was 7 years old. And by then I could read the newspapers, and my dad didn't think arithmetic was very good. He thought it'd be better he just taught me algebra. So I wasn't afraid of algebra when I got to high school, so I won the algebra contest. And that was the most embarrassing experience of my life because I was too young to have long pants in those days. I had to go get my prize in knickers, and it was just terrible to go up on this stage with all these other kids that had long pants, and here I still had to be wearing knickers. So I wasn't really very pleased about winning that contest. I was only 13 years old when I won the state high school algebra contest. And but that was my first experience in winning. And in the meantime, when I was 5 years old, I started in the vegetable growing business. We had a well out there where everybody came and pumped water, and I had a tub there, and I made a little garden. Dad had gone down to Texas, and they were promoting that part of the area, and he'd gone down there and brought back a name of a guy that would send him some onion plants. And he made a special planting that was the lind Charlie Lind, and became the Lind Plant Farm later because he started sending plants to Kansas. And Dad was the first one, and he brought these onion plants. They mailed the onion plants up to us. You see, they transplanted the onions. All the onions that were grown in Texas were transplanted at that time. And they were Bermuda onions, very wonderful onions. And so Dad said he'd take some of those plants home. They said, oh no, we don't have plants for you. We'll plant some seed for you to ship them up to you in April. That was in the middle of winter when Dad was down there. He said, we'll ship them up to you in April. Well, when they came up there, my dad didn't have time to plant them, so he gave them to me. I was 5 years old. And I took them out and planted them in a little garden right below the well. And so when people would come and pump water, I'd watch this tub all day, and when it got just about enough water in, I could still tip it over. I tipped it over and irrigated my vegetables, my onion plants. So I got in the irrigation business very early. And I learned that those onions grew great and big like that. And my mother came out there one day, and she called my father's attention to it. She says, George's onions are big enough to sell now. Look how big they are. They're big enough to sell. Well, since they were big enough to sell, I decided that was the time to harvest them. So I went out and pulled all the onions up, and cut the tops off of them, and brought them in. And oh, then they really had a fit. They said, you know, those onions are supposed to stay in the field, and the tops fall over, and then they dry down. And I said, well, I didn't know that, you know. So they decided the best thing to do is take that basket full of onions to town and see if the grocer could sell them before they'd spoil. So we took them in to Charlie Smith, who was the grocer there, and Charlie said, oh yeah, I think I can sell them. And we left the onions with him, and he paid me 5 cents a pound for them, which was a big price in those days. And so Charlie, we didn't hear any more about it. And long in October, Charlie called us back in. That was in July, the latter part of July, when I was selling the onions. And he called me back, and he says, I want to show you something. And he went in the back room, and he got up on the shelf, and he had a half a dozen of these onions that he laid up there. He says, those are the prettiest Bermudas I ever saw. He said, they dried right down, and they're just perfect. So we learned something the very first time was that if you wanted to get onions that would keep, you had to pull them out of the ground and dry them down, and before they got a lot of full mold and fungus and mildew on them from being in the wet ground, you had to get them out of the ground and dry them down. Then they were a good market onion. So that's what I learned about onions to start with. Very first time I had onions.
So when did you develop agronomics?
Well, what happened then was that I developed a real interest in two things. One was irrigation, because I knew that I could double the size of the onions. I had twice as big onions as anybody else growing them with irrigation. And the second thing was that by transplanting the plants, I could get much earlier onions, get them on the market earlier, and there wasn't anybody else selling onions then. So that was an advantage. And in 1928, well, after I got out of high school, I graduated from high school in the midterm of 28. and I put in an irrigation project at the on the creek to see if I could pump water and irrigate our place. And see, by then I was 17 years old. I was old enough to be a full-fledged farmer by 17 in those days. You were considered to be grown up by then. And so I put in this irrigation project, and I bought an old contractor's pump. The only way I could irrigate was to get it up high enough above the creek. There was one place where the creek had a high bank, and I could run the water from there down, irrigate about 28 acres of the farm. And so I put this pump in. It was an old contractor's 4-inch contractor's centrifugal pump, and the Ford motor that it had on it wasn't enough to pump the water up there. So I had to go get an old Light 6 Studebaker motor, and I started it going there, and it got hot right away. There wasn't any way it would work as a stationary motor. So then I put 4 barrels on a raised platform, and above the motor, right above the motor, I put the 4 barrels, and I pumped the water, let the water pump from the motor pump into the first barrel, and the water ran into the second barrel, and the third barrel, the fourth barrel, and the fourth barrel ran back into the engine. And that allowed me to run that engine. All I had to do is keep the gasoline in it, and I could run it 24 hours a day because it was cold enough. The water stayed cool enough, and the water would always get, you'd see that it was getting warm because it'd be, in the morning especially, it would be a lot of steam coming up off the motor, off the tanks, but the pump would just still keep right on running. It was a good old motor, but it wasn't built for stationary operation, and we converted it into a stationary operation. That was the first thing of originality that I developed, was the irrigation system there. And I learned very quickly that irrigating in Kansas wasn't the whole answer to production in Kansas, because I had some crops that did amazingly well. Tomatoes did fine, and the sweet corn was beautiful, and the peppers and the eggplant was fine, but I had some cauliflower, and it was too hot. I found out later that it was way too hot a climate for cauliflower and cabbage, lettuce and things like that at that time of year. If we were going to grow lettuce, we had to plant it real early and take that off as the first crop. And then we could take a crop of lettuce off and then a crop of tomatoes later. But we couldn't plant anything out of the right time to plant it. So then I got to thinking, how are we going to find about what is the right time to plant? And I went to the government, and the government didn't have any information at all, so I had to work it up myself. And the way I worked it up was to go to the Kansas City Packer, which is a trade paper of the produce industry, and it had the records of all the crops that are being grown anywhere in the United States, where they were grown, and when they were harvested. So I developed phenological data. That is periodic development of crops is phenological. And I developed the phenological data, and I had the weather records for all these areas, and I started developing the coordinates that it took to develop the science of agricultural bioclimatics. So by the time I got to college, I pretty well had this worked out. When I got to Kansas State, I already had the basic philosophy, and so professors got interested in what I was doing. And when I got everything worked out, then I started making predictions. And I wrote a paper in 1934. I was in college then, I was a junior then, and I wrote this paper predicting that the Kansas Call Valley potato growers were going to go out of business because they were competing against the new Shafter long whites that they developed in California. And the California potatoes were nice, clean, white potatoes. They're grown under an ideal climate. They had an ideal climate for potatoes in California. And the Kansas potatoes were harvested in the middle of the summer during the hottest weather, and they'd been shipping them all over the east. The Call Valley potatoes literally occupied the summer potato market because they had an early harvest. They were harvesting in August. And the later potatoes, Colorado and Idaho, were all later. But here come these California potatoes that cut right into their season. And it didn't take me long to see that there was no future at all for growing potatoes in Kansas. So I wrote a paper on that in 1934, pointing out that Kansas was going to go out of the potato business. That caused quite a stir because a fellow there's a company by the name of Williams and Haney was the chief potato brokers in Topeka, and they said, well, we have control of the market. We have that season. That's our season. There's no way going to go out of the potato business. So they wouldn't let me put the paper in the state college library. They told the college that a lot of the professors thought I was probably right, but they didn't have the nerve to put my paper in the college library. So it never got to the college library. And by the time World War II started, Kansas was already out of the potato business. After long whites from about 1933, in that period when they developed that area, until 1940, was long enough to completely eliminate Kansas from the potato business. And so then on, I realized that I had developed a science whereby we didn't have to do any guesswork about what crops we could grow in an area. All we had to do was get the crop coordinates, I called them the coordinates, that I could set up and make comparative analysis between one area and another and determine whether that area was going to be competitive in the production of a given crop, and whether it was be practical to continue to produce in some areas, or whether other areas are going to take over and could be dominant. The apple business was a good example because by then we were seeing that a lot of the eastern apples and a lot of the Midwest apple areas were going to go out of business when Washington developed. Washington had a superior climate, and they had a regularity of production, had a reliable enough season that they'd be able to put everybody else out of business in apples. Of course, there's some areas in California that can still produce, and some in Oregon still produce, but primarily the apple industry has moved up there. And all these other crops, and my theory at the time was that, see, I wasn't getting along very well with the college professors when I was in college because they kept saying, we've got to rotate our crops. And they were telling even the people in the wheat belt that they ought to have some other crop to put in. And there's no way the wheat belt is going to be able to grow anything but wheat. And I kept pointing that out, that anytime you find the crop that is reliable in relation to the climatic hazards and the climate conditions, that is the crop that you better concentrate on if you're going to feed the world. And that was the basic theory of bioclimatics. And I developed it in the 30s. I started to attract a lot of attention by around 1937. Henry Wallace wrote an article. See, Henry Wallace was later vice president, but he and his dad had the Wallace Farmer newspaper, and he wrote articles about me at that time, and he knew me very well that way, but didn't know me personally, but he knew what I'd accomplished and wrote articles about it. And Isaiah Bowman, the fellow that Dr. Isaiah Bowman picked up on what I was doing, and he wrote an article. He said, "Facts more valuable than all the gold in the Klondike lie buried in the weather bureau records. All we have to do is dig them out." And I was the one who's digging them out. And these are all part of history now, you know, exactly what happened.